The boardroom was silent. Not the normal kind of silence, but the sharp, frozen kind that tastes like metal on the tongue. A silence that warns you something bad is about to happen, even if you don't know why yet. It sat heavy in the air as the billionaire's voice echoed across the long marble table, bouncing off glass walls and polished floors like it owned the room. Victor Langford didn't just speak, he performed. Every word was meant to show control. Every gesture was meant to remind everyone exactly who held the power. He tapped the side of the projector with irritation, the sound snapping through the room like a ruler hitting a desk. "As you can clearly see," he said, slow and smug, "the profits will triple." His executives nodded so fast it looked like their necks might crack. No one dared to breathe wrong. No one dared to blink too long. In rooms like this, silence was obedience, and obedience kept you employed. But in the very back of that cold, perfect room, pushing an old gray mop bucket that squeaked every time it moved, stood Marlon Briggs, the night janitor, the man everyone forgot existed until they needed a trash can emptied. He had tired eyes, the kind that told a whole story without him saying a word. A quiet dignity lived in his posture, even in that faded uniform with a name patch barely holding on. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't even supposed to be in the room yet. But he'd come in early because his daughter's school play was tonight, and he refused to miss it. He had promised her he'd be there, front row, no matter what. So he pushed the bucket in slow, respectful silence, praying the meeting would end soon so he could slip out unseen. But then Langford flashed the spreadsheet again, and Marlon's chest tightened like someone had pressed a fist against his ribs. Those numbers, they weren't just off, they were dangerous. The kind of mistake that doesn't just lose money, something that collapses entire departments and costs people their jobs. Marlon blinked, trying to convince himself he was wrong, that maybe the billionaire knew something he didn't, but he'd always been good with numbers. Too good. The kind of good that used to make his students light up in pride before the school closed down and he had to take whatever work he could find. He stared at the projection again. No, this wasn't a small mistake. This was a disaster waiting to happen. He hesitated. His throat tightened. He looked at the executives, at the billionaire, at the glowing numbers on the wall. His mind raced through every reason to stay quiet. It wasn't his place. It wasn't his job. People like him didn't speak in rooms like this, and people like Langford didn't listen to people like him. But then he thought about his daughter, how he always told her to stand up for the truth, how he taught her to raise her hand in class even when her voice shook, how he told her that knowledge meant something, that it was worth using. So he swallowed, and then, in a soft, steady tone that seemed too gentle for such a sharp room, Marlon said, "Sir, that math isn't correct." The reaction was instant and violent, not physically, but emotionally. Heads snapped toward him like someone had fired a gun. Chairs scraped back in shock. One executive actually gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Another man's pen rolled off the table as he froze mid-note, and Victor Langford turned, slowly, deliberately, with a kind of stare that made full-grown adults drop into apologies before he even opened his mouth. His eyes narrowed, cold and predatory. The room changed temperature. Even the lights seemed to dim. "What did you just say?" Langford asked, each word sharp enough to cut. "You correcting me?" The room held its breath. Executives leaned back as if distance could protect them from whatever was about to happen next. Someone whispered, "He's done," under their breath. But Marlon didn't shrink. He didn't step back. He didn't apologize. He lifted one hand and pointed at the projection, respectful but unwavering. "You multiplied the overhead twice," he said. "It'll bankrupt the new division. A cold wind might as well have swept through the entire building." The tension grew so thick it felt like the walls were pressing inward. Langford took a single step closer, then another, until he towered over the janitor like a shadow swallowing light. A slow smirk curved across his mouth, The kind billionaires use when they're about to destroy someone and enjoy it. A janitor, he whispered, letting the word drip with insult. Lecturing me on business. The boardroom held its breath. People looked away as if watching would make them guilty. Someone clenched their fists beneath the table. Another pulled her tablet closer like a shield. Everyone expected the explosion, the yelling, the humiliation, the firing, maybe worse. It was coming. They felt it, but something strange happened. Langford didn't shout. He didn't throw his papers. He didn't call security. He turned back to the projection and stared at the numbers. Really stared. Marlon watched his expression change. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for a man who'd learned to read silence. The billionaire's jaw twitched. His eyes flickered with something wary, something unsettled. Then one of the executives squinted at the spreadsheet. Her face went pale. She leaned forward, zooming in on the line item Marlon had mentioned. Her eyes widened. "Wait," she whispered. Is that right?" Another executive leaned in. Then another. Then another. Then the entire room froze. Because they all saw it. The mistake was real. The danger was real. And the quiet janitor, the man they ignored, the man they never made eye contact with, had caught it before the billionaire himself. No one spoke, no one moved. Even Langford's breath hitched, barely visible but undeniable. Marlon stood there, hands still on his mop handle, staring up at the billionaire who had spent the last 10 minutes bragging about profit margins he didn't actually understand. But Marlon didn't smirk, didn't celebrate, didn't do anything but wait. Then, in the heavy silence, the truth settled over every person in that room like a weight they could no longer pretend wasn't there. Marlon was right, and not a single executive knew what that meant yet. But they all felt it, a shift, a crack, a story beginning, a storm coming, and the room for the first time all night seemed afraid. The silence didn't last long. It cracked open with sharp, uncomfortable laughter from the executives, a desperate kind of laughter, thin and nervous, the kind people use when they're scared and don't want to show it. It cut through the air deeper than insults ever could. "Well, Victor," one man joked, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "looks like you've got a mathematician on staff." A few others chuckled, but their voices trembled. Eyes shifted around the room. Pressure built like steam under a locked lid. No one knew who they were laughing at, Marlon for speaking, or Langford for being publicly corrected. And that made the laughter even more dangerous. Victor Langford's face darkened as he turned back toward the janitor. Not from embarrassment. He didn't allow himself that kind of human weakness. It was something else. Pride bruised in front of witnesses, ego scratched by the one person he never considered worth noticing. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until he stood so near Marlon that the janitor could smell the billionaire's cologne, strong, expensive, and meant to fill a room like a warning. Langford leaned in, jaw tight. "You think you're smarter than me?" he whispered, his voice smooth but dripping venom beneath that businessman smile he only used before destroying someone. "No, sir," Marlon said, his voice steady, calm, not loud, not soft, just sure of itself. "I just didn't want you losing money." The words were simple, respectful, offered without challenge, but somehow they made the tension sharper. Executives exchanged glances full of alarm. A few whispered behind hands, overstepping, out of line, doesn't know his place. Someone muttered something about calling security before this got messy. Their voices didn't have to be loud. The fear in them carried clear enough. One woman on the board leaned toward Marlon, her face tight with worry. She didn't look angry, she looked scared for him. "Just apologize," she murmured. "Please, make this go away before he explodes." But Marlon didn't apologize. He couldn't. He was thinking about his daughter. The little girl who believed her father was the smartest man in the world because he spent every night helping her with homework until she understood every number and every step. He thought about the promise he made to her to always stand up for the truth, even when people didn't want to hear it. He thought about the years he spent teaching kids who didn't believe in themselves until someone showed them they could. And he thought about how keeping quiet now would make every one of those lessons a lie. So he shook his head. I can't apologize for telling the truth. The room winced collectively. It felt like he had stepped off a cliff everyone else could see but him. Then Langford's voice boomed. Across the boardroom, loud enough to rattle the glass walls. Then you're fired. The words slammed into the room like thunder. Executives flinched. A few gasped. One man shut his laptop so fast it sounded like a slap. Before the echo even faded, a security guard appeared at the door, moving with the speed of someone trained to remove problems before they caused scenes. He stepped forward, hand already reaching for Marlon's arm. And yet, Marlon didn't move. He didn't flinch when the guard touched him, didn't pull away, didn't show fear or anger or shock. He stood there with a stillness that unsettled every person watching. He simply lifted his gaze and met the billionaire's eyes with something unexpected. Calmness. A calmness that didn't make sense in a moment like this. It rattled the room more than shouting ever could. Sir, Marlon said quietly, you asked your team why projections keep failing. I'm trying to help. Those words hung in the air like smoke, thin but impossible to ignore. They drifted toward the executives who had been nodding earlier, toward the analysts who had pretended the numbers made sense, toward the board members who'd been too scared to question Langford's decisions for months. And they drifted toward the billionaire himself, hitting something inside him he didn't expect to feel. Because beneath the fury in his eyes, beneath the pride and the anger and the instinct to crush anyone who challenged him, something flickered, doubt. It didn't last long, it didn't grow big. But it was there, a tiny crack in the armor. A brief moment where Langford questioned himself, not out loud, not visibly, but deep enough for everyone to sense something had changed. And that terrified the room more than the shouting. Executives stiffened in their seats. A few exchanged looks that said, "Did you see that?" Others looked away quickly as if pretending not. To notice could protect them. The guard hesitated, still holding Marlon's arm but no longer pulling. The billionaire's jaw flexed. His hands curled into fists, then relaxed again. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to roar, but nothing came out for a moment. That silence was louder than any threat he could have shouted. People in the room began shifting uncomfortably, not because they were on Marlon's side, not because they suddenly cared about fairness, but because they sensed something rare. The powerful man they depended on didn't feel as powerful in this moment. And when a man like Victor Langford cracks, even for a second, the people who orbit him feel it like a tremor. Marlon didn't push, didn't add fuel. He just held the billionaire's gaze with a tired steadiness, the kind a man earns only through years of hardship, years of being overlooked, years of being told he was less than what he knew he was. The guard finally released his arm, unsure whether to continue the removal or wait for new instructions. Executives avoided eye contact with both men. A strange quiet settled into the room again, different from the first silence. This one didn't belong to Langford's authority. It belonged to uncertainty. And uncertainty in the world of the powerful is the one thing nobody knows how to manage. Langford stepped back, just a few inches, but in this room it felt like a mile. His eyes narrowed again, but the anger in them was no longer pure. It was mixed with something else he couldn't hide fast enough. He looked at the spreadsheet, then at the executives, then back at the janitor. The flicker of doubt returned and stayed. The moment stretched long and tense, as if the room itself was waiting for the next breath, because everyone understood something silently. If the billionaire doubted himself even for a heartbeat, then the power in this room had just shifted, and no one knew where it would land next. Marlon was halfway to the door, his steps slow and heavy, the mop handle still in his hand like a piece of his dignity he refused to drop. The security guard stayed close behind him, not gripping him but shadowing him, waiting for the final order that would remove him from this world forever. The boardroom felt colder with every step he took. Silence had returned, but it wasn't the icy, controlled silence that belonged to Victor Langford. This silence was different. It felt unsettled, uneasy, like everyone in that room had just witnessed something they didn't quite know how to understand, and maybe didn't want to. Then a deep voice cut through the air. "Bring him back." It wasn't Langford's voice, not the sharp, commanding tone they all expected. This voice carried age, weight, wisdom, and authority that didn't have to shout to be obeyed. Every head turned as the chair of the board lifted her gaze. Dr. Estelle Rowan, an older black woman with silver-streaked hair and a stare that had seen too much, sat at the far end of the table. She rarely spoke unless the room was on the edge of disaster, which, judging from the fear flashing across the executives' faces, was exactly where they were. The guards stopped immediately. Marlon froze. The executives shuffled in their seats, suddenly uneasy as if the floor beneath them had tilted. Langford stiffened, jaw clenching, but he didn't argue. Not with her. No one argued with Dr. Rowan, not if they wanted to keep their position. She tapped her cane once against the floor, a soft sound, but in that room it echoed like a commandment. "Marlon," she said, her voice calm and steady, "how did you catch that error?" For a moment he didn't answer. It wasn't fear that held him still, it was disbelief. People didn't ask him questions in rooms like this. People didn't even look at him, unless they needed a trash can emptied or a spill wiped up. But he stepped forward anyway and set his mop gently against the wall. He straightened his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of being overlooked. "I used to be a math teacher," he said quietly. "Lost my job when the school closed. Been cleaning offices ever since." A ripple moved through the board, not a physical one, an emotional one. Shock, guilt, recognition. Several pens froze mid-air, suspended in the hands that held them. Eyes widened. A few executives leaned forward without meaning to. Everything they assumed about him cracked open in an instant. But the real shock hadn't arrived yet. Dr. Rowan lifted a manila folder from the stack beside her. She opened it slowly, as if unveiling a secret she had been waiting for the right moment to reveal. "The same mistake," she said, "appears in the last 3 proposals." The words dropped like stones into a still lake, and the ripples were far stronger this time. 3 proposals approved by Langford, 3 divisions now failing. The billionaire's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Sweat gathered at his temple. His eyes darted to the projector, then to his board, then to the papers he had defended only minutes ago. For the first time since anyone had known him, Victor Langford didn't look certain. He didn't look powerful. He looked afraid. Dr. Rowan didn't look at him. She turned her attention back to the janitor, the man holding the mop like it was both his burden and his anchor. "Marlon," she said, "could you walk us through the correct calculation?" Marlon blinked. He had taught kids who didn't believe they were smart enough to multiply, much less understand a budget. He had spent nights grading papers on a couch he couldn't afford to replace. He had practiced patience with children who threw pencils and cried over frack. Chans. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Standing before a group of people who ran companies and owned buildings, holding their attention not because he mopped their floors, but because he understood something they didn't. He nodded. His hands shook slightly as he stepped toward the screen, but his voice was steady. Steadier than Langford's had been, steadier than anyone else's in the room. He picked up the digital pen, erased the flawed numbers, and began rewriting them with crisp precision. Line by line, step by step, slowly, clearly, like he was teaching again. As he explained each calculation, the room grew quieter. Not the fearful, brittle silence from earlier. This silence carried respect. The board members leaned forward. Their eyes followed every number he wrote. They weren't mocking him now. They weren't doubting him. They were learning from him. And Marlon wasn't rushing. He took his time. He breathed through the tension. He showed them how one small oversight, one repeated multiplication, one simple error had triggered losses in the millions. He didn't say it with pride. He didn't say it with bitterness. He said it like someone who simply wanted the truth to be seen. By the time he set the pen down, the room wasn't the same. No one looked at him like a janitor anymore. They looked at him like a man with knowledge, a man with value, a man they should have listened to much earlier. A revelation settled over the boardroom like a quiet storm rolling in, slow, heavy, unavoidable. The janitor wasn't the problem. He never had been. He was the solution they never even bothered to look for. The executives exchanged glances, but these looks were different now, reflective, humbled. Some looked ashamed, others looked impressed. One or two looked worried about what this meant for their own positions. But Langford, he looked small, not because anyone said it, not because anyone dared to point it out, but because the truth had stripped him of the power he wore like armor. The truth exposed him in front of the very people he ruled with fear, and everyone in that room could see it. Dr. Rowan folded her hands calmly. Marlon stood quietly by the screen, waiting. The billionaire swallowed hard, the sound loud in the stillness. His face was pale, his confidence shaken, his authority cracked. For the first time since stepping into power, Victor Langford wasn't the biggest presence in the boardroom. The man holding the mop was, and though no one dared to say it yet, they all felt something shifting, something no one could undo. When Marlon finished explaining the numbers, the boardroom slipped into a silence so deep it felt like the room itself had stopped breathing. Even the lights seemed to dim, as if the building wanted to bow its head out of respect. Papers sat untouched. Pens hovered above notepads without moving. The executives who had laughed earlier now sat stiff, eyes fixed on the man who just stood there with his worn uniform, dusty shoes, and a calm that didn't fit the moment but somehow owned it completely. No one spoke. No one dared. The truth had settled in, and it demanded quiet. Finally, after what felt like a full minute, Dr. Estelle Rowan folded her hands on the table. Her voice broke the silence, but gently, like someone pushing open a door that had been locked for too long. "Marlon Briggs," she said, "we need someone with your clarity. Would you consider joining our analytics team?" The words hit him like a wave he didn't see coming. He blinked, unsure he heard her right. For years he had scrubbed coffee stains from conference tables and wiped dust off glass doors. For years he'd been the man people rushed past without a greeting, the man they talked around as if he were part of the furniture. Now, in this cold marble room where power usually spoke only to power, someone had looked at him and seen worth. His breath caught in his throat. He didn't smile, didn't step forward, didn't celebrate. The offer felt unreal, like a dream he wasn't supposed to touch. After so much invisible labor, after so many nights wondering if he failed his daughter by not being able to give her more, after all the times he had swallowed pride just to keep a job, someone finally saw him, but the moment didn't belong to him alone. Because as soon as Dr. Rowan finished speaking, every eye in the room turned toward Victor Langford, the billionaire who had tried to fire him just minutes earlier, the man whose empire sprang from the numbers he trusted so completely, and the man whose pride had been cracked open by a janitor with a mop and a steady voice. It was his company, his boardroom, his meeting, his pride on the table. The entire room waited, not just for his approval, not just for his reaction, but for whatever storm he might unleash. They expected rage. They expected denial. They expected him to reclaim control by crushing the man who had dared to challenge him. Instead, something unexpected happened. Langford stood, slowly, his chair sliding back with a long, soft scrape. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare at the board members who were now questioning his judgment. He walked forward with shoulders heavy, but not with anger, with something far quieter, something almost human. He stopped in front of Marlon, so close they could both hear each other breathe. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't the booming, powerful tone he used to command rooms. It was quieter, thinner, almost fragile. "I let my ego make decisions," he said. The room shifted. Executives exchanged glances, wide-eyed. Some leaned back, others leaned forward. They had never heard anything like this from him before. Langford swallowed hard. "You saved me from a disaster," he continued, "and I repaid you with disrespect." The admission hung in the air like a confession. No one knew where to look. Even Dr. Rowan's eyes softened. Then Langford did something even more shocking. He extended his hand. "If you'll accept it," he said, "I apologize." For a moment, Marlon froze. He looked at the hand, but not with anger. With something deeper, something tired. He thought about every job where he'd been dismissed. Every supervisor who spoke to him like he was less than a man. Every time he bit his tongue to keep steady income. And every long night he had held his daughter, promising her she would grow up knowing her worth even if the world refused to see his. He hesitated, not because he held hatred in his heart, but because forgiveness is heavy and no one should ever rush it. Then he took the billionaire's hand and shook it, not for Langford, not to make the room comfortable. He did it for himself, for his own peace, for the dignity that had been denied too long. A soft exhale moved through the room like everyone had been holding their breath. Dr. Rowan nodded once. Then she turned to the board. "All in favor?" Hands rose without hesitation. Even the executives who had laughed earlier lifted theirs quickly, eyes lowered in shame. The vote was unanimous. Marlon Briggs was hired. Just like that. The guard stepped back. The executives straightened, their suits. Langford took a slow breath, still visibly wrestling with the shock of humility. "And Marlon..." He picked up his mop, but not the same way he did earlier. This time he didn't hold it like a burden. He held it like a reminder of where he came from, of what he survived, of how far the truth could lift a person when they refused to bow. As he walked out of the boardroom, his head was high, shoulders finally relaxed. His uniform was still dusty, still worn, still faded. But inside his chest, something bright woke up again. Something he hadn't felt in years. Dignity had returned home. He paused in the hallway, taking one long breath, letting the weight of the moment wash over him. The world outside that boardroom didn't know what had just happened. It didn't know a janitor had stood toe-to-toe with a billionaire and changed the direction of an entire company. It didn't know a man who'd been overlooked for years had just been given the chance to rise. But he knew, and that was enough. And like every Black Voice's story, the truth came clear and simple. Sometimes the person the world overlooks is the one holding the wisdom to save it. Respect everyone. Listen deeply, because greatness doesn't wear a title. It reveals itself quietly, in moments when no one expects it.